Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity settles gently into the quiet spaces of the evening, and science unfolds at a pace that lets you rest while your thoughts stretch a little. Tonight, we're drifting toward a place older than almost any story humans have ever told. A place where stone meets sky, where heat moves across the desert like a slow wave, and where one question has lingered for centuries longer than most civilizations. What if the pyramids are only the surface of something much bigger? Not just larger in size, but larger in meaning, in design, in the silent past that still lies tucked beneath the sand. Before we wander any farther, let me ask the simple question that always seems to ground us, even when the topic grows enormous. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it for you in this moment? I ask not just out of habit, but because it's strangely comforting to imagine all of us scattered across the world, each in our own late-night space, arriving here together through a pathway of ideas that stretches beyond geography. If you find this kind of slow exploration soothing, or a good companion for winding down, I'd be grateful if you tapped the like button or subscribed, so that this cozy corner of curiosity finds others who might need the same quiet company. You don't need to know anything about archaeology to enjoy where we're heading. You don't need to remember dates or dynasties or obscure terminology. All you need really is a bit of wonder, because the pyramids have a way of inspiring that even in people who don't usually feel drawn to ancient history. They stand with such confidence that it's hard not to assume we understand them. There they are, sharp-angled and sunlit, familiar from textbooks and documentaries. But those are only the parts above ground, the parts tourists photograph, the parts that sit neatly against the blue of the sky. And tonight we're going to let the mind wander downward, below the sunlight, below the limestone, below even the foundations. We're letting ourselves drift into the idea that these structures might be markers, not monuments, entrances, not endpoints, the visible half of something still hidden. When most people picture the pyramids, they see vast triangles rising out of the sand. Huge, yes, but still taking up only a small portion of the physical landscape. We often forget that these structures have been dug around, tunnelled beneath, scanned and mapped for more than a century. And yet, even with modern technology, most of what lies under them remains uncertain. Cavities that appear on scans don't always line up with what excavators expect. Pathways that were predicted to be short turn out to run farther than they should. Rooms appear in places where rooms were never supposed to be, and every so often someone releases new findings that make researchers pause, because the ground beneath Giza behaves in ways that aren't entirely consistent with natural geology or simple architectural planning. But we're not rushing there yet. There's something about approaching the pyramids slowly, as if they're not just buildings but participants in a conversation that began thousands of years ago. The very act of imagining them at night, under a sky full of stars that humans have watched since long before the first block was ever quarried, puts you in a kind of quiet state. These structures have seen entire worlds rise and fall. Every language you know and every idea you've ever heard about them is modern compared to their age. And still they remain, sitting on bedrock that is older still. You can almost feel that weight, not overwhelming or heavy, but steady. Like leaning against a wall that has been here so long it barely notices your presence. People often ask why the pyramids are so fascinating. Maybe it's because they look precise, almost impossibly so for structures built with no modern machinery. Or because they survived when so many monumental works of the ancient world didn't. But perhaps the deeper reason is that they hide things. Not deliberately in a dramatic way, but naturally the way old structures do when they sink into the landscape over time. The sand builds up around them, the walls weather, the chambers settle. What we see is only the outline. What we don't see is everything else. And the unknown has a way of keeping our attention, especially at night, when the mind is calmer and more willing to linger on possibilities. Some researchers believe the pyramids are just one layer of a much larger complex, a complex that extends far below the ground. Not a single basement or a single burial chamber, but networks. Rooms linked to rooms, corridors that were cut with surprising precision, caves that seem natural until you notice cuts that are too straight or angles that feel too intentional. There are older accounts from the 1800s of explorers describing entire underground halls so vast that their torches barely illuminated the far walls. Some of those descriptions sound exaggerated, but not all of them can be dismissed, and even modern surveys have flagged regions beneath Giza that behave strangely on seismic readings, as if there are open spaces where solid rock should be. But don't think of this as a thriller. Think of it more like walking slowly through a museum at closing time. The lights are dim, the hallways feel still, and your footsteps echo not because of fear but because of the quiet. That same quiet surrounds the pyramids if you stand near them after sunset. The temperature drops, the wind moves grains of sand you can barely see, and the stones themselves take on a different texture. Cooler, almost soft. When you imagine what might lie beneath them, it's not about danger or hidden threats. It's more about scale. The scale of what humans attempted, and maybe the scale of what we have not yet recognized. The idea that the pyramids may only be the upper portion of something larger isn't new. Historians, geologists, and even some engineers have flirted with the possibility for decades. But the conversation rarely enters the mainstream because it doesn't fit comfortably into a simple explanation. We like tidy stories about ancient structures. A pyramid is a tomb, a monument, a giant triangular building built for one purpose. It's easier when things have single meanings. But the more you study the Giza Plateau, the more it seems that these structures might have been part of a much broader design. Something that required not just architectural skill, but a kind of planning that spanned generations. The above-ground portion may be only the most visible piece, like the peak of a mountain that extends deep underwater. Consider the bedrock itself. The surface around Giza shows signs of shaping, levelling and trenching that don't line up neatly with the construction phases of the visible pyramids. There are marks that appear older, as if the ground was prepared for something long before the structures we now see were built. Some parts of the plateau feel carved rather than natural. Other parts look reinforced or altered, in ways that suggest the builders were concerned not just with what would stand on the surface, but with what might sit below it. There are even ancient texts that speak vaguely about underground regions associated with the pyramids, though the descriptions are symbolic and not literal instructions for excavation. Still, it's hard not to wonder whether those symbolic descriptions originated from something real, something people once knew and later transformed into myth. Before imagining massive hidden complexes, it's important to remember that ancient civilizations often built downward as much as upward. Tombs ran deep underground. Temples sometimes extended into the earth. Storage chambers, ceremonial spaces and administrative rooms were frequently placed beneath structures rather than within them. So the idea that the pyramids might sit atop extensive subterranean features isn't outlandish. It would fit with patterns seen across the ancient world, and when you apply modern scanning technologies to the area, anomalies appear. Not every anomaly means a chamber, but consistent anomalies, appearing in aligned patterns beneath multiple structures, that raises questions. And questions are where the real exploration begins, not with assumptions, not with dramatic scenarios, but with simple recognition that the surface rarely tells the full story. The pyramids themselves give us clues. Their size, their alignment, their internal passages, all incredibly deliberate. So deliberate that it's difficult to imagine the builders leaving the ground below them to chance. If you were planning something that would endure for thousands of years, something that had to survive earthquakes, erosion and shifting sands, would you build only upward? Or would you anchor everything in a foundation that extended deep beneath the surface? Even now, when standing at the edge of the Great Pyramid, the sheer weight of it presses down into the bedrock with enormous force. The builders would have needed to understand that. They would have needed to prepare the ground in a way that distributed that weight, and the evidence shows that they did. The bedrock beneath is shaped, flattened, stepped, and reinforced. But some of the reinforcement patterns don't match what would be needed solely for stability. They look intentional in ways that imply access, not just support. Imagine for a moment walking along the desert floor near Giza. The ground looks empty, a scattering of stones, dust, and the occasional tool left from a modern excavation site. But beneath your feet there could be rooms you've never heard of, not in a sensational way, but in a practical, architectural way. Chambers that were cut for reasons we don't yet know, hallways that lead to other spaces, areas so deep that modern scans only hint at their presence. Cavities that weren't accidents or natural caves, but deliberate shapes carved into the bedrock long before we arrived to wonder about them. This doesn't imply secret societies or hidden technology from distant stars. It simply means the ancient world was often more layered than we assume. Builders worked with the earth as much as they worked above it. They used the landscape as part of the design, integrating stone, sand, and the natural features of the plateau. The pyramids were placed where they are for a reason, and the ground beneath them was shaped for a reason too. A reason that may be connected to a system we haven't fully mapped yet. Thinking about this doesn't need to be dramatic. You can picture it in a calm, steady way. A group of ancient planners standing on the plateau thousands of years ago, discussing where to carve channels, where to level surfaces, where to create spaces that would later be sealed or repurposed. They may have envisioned not just a structure but a landscape, a place where stone architecture and natural geology blended into a single design. What we see today could be the upper skin of that design, the visible portion that has managed to withstand erosion and time, and here we are now, thousands of years later, still trying to understand what they understood, still trying to interpret signals left in the ground, still wondering whether the pyramids we see are the complete story, or simply the top layer of something that stretches beneath the desert in ways we haven't yet imagined. When you picture the desert surrounding the pyramids, you might imagine an empty expanse, a quiet, open space where the air feels still and the horizon stretches without interruption. But the desert around Giza isn't simply a backdrop. It's part of the design, whether intentionally shaped by the builders or naturally cooperating with their plans. And once you begin noticing how the land frames those enormous structures, something curious happens. The pyramids start to feel even larger than their measurements suggest, not in a dramatic or exaggerated way, but in a very subtle one, as if the environment itself amplifies their scale without you quite realizing how. It's an odd thing. When you stand close to the Great Pyramid, its size is undeniable. The blocks tower above you, each one so solid that you instinctively understand why they have endured for so long. But as you step back, the structure doesn't shrink the way distant buildings do. It holds its shape, it keeps its definition. The desert seems to cooperate, shaping the space in a way that prevents the eye from minimizing what it sees. You can be hundreds of meters away, and it still feels immediate, still feels present. There are very few man-made structures in the world that behave like that. Some researchers think this effect has to do with how the pyramid's geometry interacts with the landscape. The desert around Giza isn't completely flat. It has gentle slopes, raised ridges, slight depressions, subtle curves, but the angles of the pyramids override that complexity. The clean lines stand out so sharply against the muted surroundings that your mind locks onto them as a reference point. And once that happens, everything else, the sand, the sky, the ridges, fades slightly into the background. The desert doesn't compete with the pyramids, it frames them. Even in photographs, this effect comes through. You can scroll through images taken from different angles, different lighting conditions, different distances, and the pyramids always seem to hold the same weight. They never appear small, they never feel like they've been swallowed by the landscape. The geometry is too assertive. Not loud, not showy, just steady. Those triangular planes meet at such precise angles that they carve themselves into your perception, even when your conscious attention is drifting. What makes this interesting is that ancient builders didn't just rely on the shape of the pyramids to create that impression, they shaped the terrain itself. Archaeologists have found carved ledges, levelled surfaces, and artificially flattened stretches of ground that extend far beyond the visible base of the pyramids. These areas aren't simply construction platforms. They appear intentionally arranged to create a stable visual plane around the structures. When you're close to them, the effect isn't obvious, but with distance it becomes clearer. The land behaves like a pedestal, a wide, subtle platform that helps the pyramids dominate the environment even before you reach them. And then there's the matter of orientation. The pyramids align with astonishing precision to the cardinal directions. Perfectly north, perfectly east, perfectly south, perfectly west. This isn't just symbolic. The effect reinforces the geometry when you view the structures from different angles. No matter where you stand, the symmetry remains intact. It's almost impossible to find a viewpoint where the pyramids look off. You can approach from the east or the west, from the north or the south, and the balance holds. This is unusual for ancient structures, which often have design elements that work best from a particular vantage point. The pyramids work from all of them. The landscape bends to them, not the other way around. When you combine all these factors, geometry, orientation, the carved terrain, the surrounding slopes, you begin to understand why the pyramids feel larger than they measure. Your mind doesn't get visual cues that normally help you judge distance or relative size. The desert removes clutter, no trees, no buildings, no crowded skyline, nothing to frame the structures in a familiar way. The pyramids become the only strong vertical elements for miles, which tricks the brain into reading them as impossibly massive. It's the same phenomenon that makes mountains seem larger when they rise alone rather than as part of a range. Isolation magnifies scale. People who visit often report that the pyramids look bigger the farther they move from them, which is the opposite of what should happen. The explanation lies partly in perception and partly in the geometry of lines meeting at precise angles. When you stand too close, the slope of the pyramid face makes it hard to see the full shape. But as you step back, the silhouette sharpens. There's a moment when the pyramid seems to grow as you retreat, because your brain finally gathers enough information to understand the full structure. Once you realize this, you can't unsee it. The desert is assisting the architecture, providing the space needed for the geometry to reveal itself. This behavior also hints at something deeper. If the visual and physical presence of the pyramids extends far beyond their immediate footprint, then the space they occupy in the landscape is much larger than what the stones alone define. Their influence spreads across the plateau, across the horizon, across the desert's quiet surface. And that influence may not be just visual. There are indications that the layout of the pyramids relates to geological features beneath the sand. Subtle ridges in the bedrock align with the placement of the structures. Ancient trenches cut into the plateau correspond to underground layers. It's as if the builders didn't just place the pyramids randomly on the surface. They selected locations where the earth beneath could support something much more expansive. Some studies have pointed out that the plateau's natural rock formations seem to form a kind of skeleton beneath the desert. A system of harder limestone ribs surrounded by softer layers. These ribs could have guided the placement of the pyramids, giving them a natural foundation that could carry immense weight. But they could also serve another role. Soft layers of rock are easier to excavate. Hard layers make for excellent support. If someone wanted to construct chambers or corridors beneath the pyramids, this natural geologic combination would be almost ideal. It's one of the rare places where the earth itself seems prepared for large subterranean structures. And when you think about how the pyramids interact with the environment above ground, it becomes interesting to imagine the same interaction happening below. The surface geometry extends into the desert air, but what if mirrored complexity extends downward into the bedrock? Not identical shapes, but a corresponding system organized around natural features. The pyramid could be the visible apex of a larger design anchored deep beneath it, a design that uses the desert's natural geometry just as effectively as it uses the sky. There's also something subtle about the way the pyramids cast shadows. Throughout the day, the angles shift gradually, tracing predictable lines across the sand. These shadows don't just mark time, they shape how the structures appear. In early morning and late afternoon, when the sun rests lower in the sky, the pyramids look taller. Their silhouettes stretch, their outlines sharpen. If you've ever seen photographs taken at these times, you know they almost look like entirely different buildings. This shifting of appearance adds another layer to the feeling that the pyramids are much larger than they seem. You're not seeing static objects. You're seeing objects that interact with light in a way that emphasizes their presence. Modern architects sometimes design buildings specifically to manipulate light and shadow, but the Egyptians were doing it thousands of years ago on a scale that remains difficult to replicate. The simplicity of the pyramid shape hides an extraordinary level of control over how the structure behaves visually in different lighting conditions. And that consistency across light, distance and terrain is part of what makes these structures feel so immense. Even when the air is hazy or the sun is harsh, they hold their form, they hold their balance, they hold their presence. Now imagine the same builders who created this effect above ground, also carving into the earth below. The same precision, the same understanding of how space behaves, the same awareness of where the strongest layers of bedrock lie. If their goal was to create something stable and enduring, extending the design downward would make sense. The part that rises above the sand would be only the portion visible to the world. The functional or ceremonial parts could lie beneath, protected from erosion, wind and weather. It's not a far-fetched idea. Many ancient structures have large underground components. What makes Giza different is the scale. As researchers continue to study the plateau, they find more signs that the desert itself may be part of the architecture. Some corridors beneath the surface seem to follow natural pathways in the rock. Others cut through areas where the stone is unusually easy to shape. If these passageways were intentional, then the builders understood the subtle geometry of the desert, as well as they understood the geometry of the pyramids themselves. They worked with the landscape, not against it. And that cooperation creates a kind of harmony that makes the structures feel like they belong exactly where they are. This sense of belonging is part of why the pyramids feel bigger than their physical size. They don't look like buildings placed onto the land. They look like extensions of the land. They rise from it in a way that feels inevitable, as if the desert itself intended to hold something of that shape. And when you stand far enough away to take in the entire landscape, the effect is even stronger. The pyramids don't just sit in the desert, they organize it. The sand around them feels like part of their footprint. The emptiness becomes part of the structure. This might be one reason the idea of something larger beneath the pyramids is so compelling. The visible parts interact with the space in such a complete way that it's easy to imagine the same is true below the surface. The structures don't feel like isolated monuments. They feel like the tips of something that extends in every direction, upward into the air, outward across the desert, and possibly downward into the earth. People often think of the pyramids as giant stone triangles, but their impact is more like an invisible field stretching across the desert floor. A field created not by mysticism or speculation, but by geometry, engineering, landscape shaping, and the natural behavior of light. When you begin to look at them with that perspective, the suggestion that the visible stones might be only one layer of a much larger system stops sounding exaggerated. It begins to sound consistent with everything the structures already do. The quiet geometry of the desert doesn't complicate the pyramids, it amplifies them. And once you see how carefully that relationship seems to function above ground, it becomes easier to imagine that the same careful thought might exist beneath the surface as well, still waiting under the bedrock for us to understand its purpose. When most people look at the pyramids, the instinct is to lift the eyes. Everything about their structure pulls your attention upward, toward the apex, toward the sky, toward the imagination of height. But the more time you spend thinking about these monuments, the more you realize that the direction we rarely consider might be the one that holds the most unanswered questions. Not above, but below. The ground beneath the pyramids has been supporting their weight for thousands of years, yet for most of that time it has remained largely out of sight and out of mind, and that makes it a kind of quiet frontier, a frontier that doesn't require speculation or dramatic theories, only a willingness to look where we usually don't. The first thing to understand about what lies beneath the pyramids is that the bedrock of the Giza Plateau is not simply a slab of stone waiting passively under the structures. It's a layered, uneven, geologically complex foundation. Some parts rise in natural ridges, others descend into softer pockets that have been shaped by ancient water flows. The ground has texture, history, and patterns. And those patterns matter because ancient builders were extremely skilled at reading landscapes. They weren't guessing when they placed the pyramids on this specific plateau. They chose it because the ground had qualities well suited for long-term stability and for large-scale cutting. When you think of a foundation, you probably imagine something like the concrete base of a modern building, straightforward and uniform. But the base of the pyramids isn't like that. The builders carved steps into the natural rock, creating terraces that help distribute the enormous weight. Some portions of the pyramids sit directly on shaped bedrock instead of man-made blocks. This suggests that the ground was not just reinforcing the structure, but actively built into the design from the very beginning. The stone beneath wasn't an obstacle, it was part of the plan. If you picture workers carving into the limestone thousands of years ago, you might imagine them creating simple flat surfaces. But what archaeologists have found is much more complicated. There are cuttings that extend well beyond the footprint of the pyramids, trenches that form rectangular outlines, depressions that mirror the shape of the structures above but in reverse. These features don't look accidental. They look like the early stages of something much larger, as if the builders were preparing not just for what would rise above the surface, but for what might be shaped beneath it. Over time, these carved features were covered by sand and debris. Some were buried intentionally, others simply sank into the landscape as centuries passed. But once modern excavations began uncovering them, researchers noticed that the patterns weren't random. They lined up with certain corridors inside the pyramids. They aligned with shafts. They followed geological seams in the bedrock, and in some places they hinted at cavities that had never been fully explored. It's important to avoid imagining these underground regions as dramatic caverns or giant halls illuminated by mysterious torches. The reality is almost always quieter. Many of the spaces beneath the pyramids might be small, narrow, or filled with rubble. But size isn't the point. Purpose is. Even a small chamber, if deliberately placed, tells a story. And what makes the story beneath the pyramids interesting is that several ancient accounts from early Greek and Roman writers mention underground features associated with the Giza Plateau. Most of those writings were filtered through myth or interpreted symbolically, but even stripped of exaggeration, the idea that something existed below the surface was not unusual in the ancient world. People expected it, they assumed it. Modern technology has tried to answer that assumption. Ground-penetrating radar, seismic mapping, microgravity surveys, and thermal imaging have all been applied to the pyramids. The results are intriguing because they consistently show anomalies beneath the structures. Some are small voids, others are elongated shapes that resemble tunnels. A few appear to be larger cavities that don't correspond to any known chambers. These findings aren't treated as proof of vast hidden complexes. Instead, they are markers, signals from the bedrock that there is more down there than a single solid layer of stone. One of the challenges in interpreting these anomalies is that the ground beneath Giza is difficult to survey with perfect accuracy. The limestone layers vary in density. Some absorb signals, others scatter them. This can produce readings that appear misleading. But when multiple types of scans agree on the general shape or location of a feature, it becomes harder to dismiss. Over the years, surveys have repeatedly indicated that the plateau holds cavities of various sizes, some shallow, some deep, some near known structures, some far enough away that their purpose is unclear. Excavations beneath the plateau have revealed something else as well. There are tunnels whose walls seem too regular to be natural. There are shafts cut with straight lines that don't appear to have been created by erosion. There are small chambers whose entrances are now blocked, buried, or simply forgotten. A few of these features were documented by early explorers in the 19th century, long before modern archaeology took shape. Their journals described descending into underground spaces that seemed unexpectedly large or unexpectedly clean. Some of those accounts are likely exaggerated, but not all, and even the ones that seem embellished still point to something curious. Explorers consistently found access points beneath the plateau that we no longer use today. If the ground beneath Giza contains numerous cut spaces, it raises a question that hasn't been fully answered. Why were these underground spaces created in the first place? Some may have been storage rooms, others might have been test cuts for quarrying, some could have been related to burial practices or ritual functions we no longer understand. But there is also a possibility that they were part of the larger architectural plan. A plan that didn't view the pyramids as isolated objects, but as components of an entire system. Imagine for a moment standing at the base of the Great Pyramid and knowing that the ground beneath you is not just solid rock, but a layered network of carved surfaces and buried structures. Imagine that some of those features were created before the first stone of the pyramid was placed. Imagine that others were added later, part of an ongoing process that took generations to complete. This idea doesn't require speculation about lost civilizations or impossible technology. It only requires acknowledging that ancient Egyptians were sophisticated planners who often built in phases that spanned decades, sometimes centuries. The more you think about this, the more the idea of a multi-layered design becomes reasonable. The ancient builders would have needed access to the foundations during construction. They would have carved working chambers, storage areas, and pathways that connected various parts of the site. Once the upper structure was complete, many of these underground spaces might have been sealed, repurposed, or forgotten. Over thousands of years, sand, sediment, and shifting ground would have hidden them. What remains now is a mixture of visible elements and buried remnants that don't immediately line up with the neat, polished explanations we're used to hearing. In a way, the ground beneath the pyramids behaves like a forgotten archive. Not an archive of scrolls or artifacts necessarily, but an archive of architectural choices. Each cut in the bedrock carries information about how the builders approached the project. Each filled shaft marks a decision. Each buried chamber represents a moment in the original construction process that we no longer see, because we only focus on what stands above. One particularly interesting feature beneath the plateau is a set of natural cavities that seem to have been expanded or reshaped. These cavities formed long before humans arrived. They are the result of ancient water activity from a time when the region was much wetter. Water can hollow out limestone in unpredictable ways, sometimes leaving behind rounded chambers or narrow channels. Some researchers think the builders may have used these natural cavities as starting points. Instead of digging entirely new spaces, they expanded, corrected, and reinforced what nature had already carved. This combination of natural and artificial shaping is common in ancient architecture. It represents efficiency and adaptation, not mystery. But when applied to a site as large and important as Giza, it hints at a more integrated relationship between the builders and the land. Another intriguing factor is the presence of vertical shafts beneath certain areas. Some of these shafts are known, others appear only in older reports. Vertical shafts are often misunderstood by the public. People tend to imagine them as dramatic descents into hidden chambers, but most ancient shafts had practical uses. They provided ventilation during construction. They allowed workers to lower materials into enclosed spaces. They served as access points for adjustments and reinforcement. If the plateau contains multiple shafts like this, then it suggests an organised strategy for building and maintaining underground features. It's also worth noting that the depth of some of these shafts has never been fully measured, because many are blocked by debris. When early explorers attempted to descend them, they often stopped once they reached unstable sections. Modern teams are cautious about excavating too deeply, because digging into ancient ground can destabilize surrounding structures. So it's possible that some of these shafts extend farther than we currently realize, and if they do, They could connect to lower chambers or corridors that haven't yet been documented. As you continue imagining the ground beneath the pyramids, you begin to visualize layers, not in a dramatic sense, but in a structural one. Layers of carved stone, layers of natural cavities, layers of sediment that have settled over centuries, layers of construction phases, layers of forgotten spaces. These layers form a kind of quiet complexity that mirrors the precision we see above ground, but in a more subdued way. When you stop looking upward and allow your attention to turn downward, the sight becomes more three-dimensional. It's no longer a triangle rising from the sand. It becomes a deep structure that occupies vertical space both above and below the surface. And that vertical depth tells a story about intention. Builders who invest so much effort into shaping the ground are not doing so accidentally. They are preparing for something that requires precision, something that involves stability, something that might extend beyond what was intended to be visible. Standing on the plateau and imagining all of this doesn't feel overwhelming. It feels steady. The desert is quiet. The wind moves slowly. The stones have settled into their places after thousands of years of heat and cold. Beneath all of that, the bedrock remains. It holds its secrets without urgency. And when you picture those hidden spaces, they don't feel dramatic. They feel patient. They're part of the landscape now, interwoven with the natural layers of earth. This is where the idea begins to shift, not toward speculation or fantasy, but toward a simple acknowledgement that the pyramids may be physically larger than the visible structures. The ground beneath them could hold extensions of the architecture that haven't yet been fully explored, not because they're intentionally concealed, but because the focus has always been upward. The more we look downward, the more details we notice. The more details we notice, the more questions arise. When you picture the people who built the pyramids, it's easy to imagine workers shaping blocks, hauling stones, and setting them into place under the sun. But beneath that familiar image was an entire network of planners, designers, and engineers working long before the first block was ever lifted. The more we learn about ancient construction methods, the clearer it becomes that these structures were not the result of guesswork or brute force. They were built from plans, detailed plans, executed with a level of foresight that suggests a blueprint far more complex than the visible architecture hints at. And once you start thinking about the project from the perspective of engineers rather than stone carriers, the pyramids begin to look less like isolated monuments, and more like components in a much larger design. One of the most striking things about the pyramids is the consistency in their layout. The angles are deliberate, the base alignment is deliberate. The internal passages follow precise orientations. Even the smallest deviations appear to have been corrected during construction. The builders didn't simply stack stones. They measured, they recalculated, they adjusted. When you study the internal structure of the Great Pyramid, for example, it becomes clear that the builders changed their approach, at least once partway through construction. They added chambers, modified passageways, and corrected the orientation of certain features. This isn't evidence of confusion. It's evidence of expertise, flexible planning, real-time engineering. The more you examine these decisions, the more it becomes apparent that the builders had an understanding of geometry that rivals modern methods, not in terms of equations written on paper, but in terms of practical application. They knew how to measure angles with extraordinary accuracy. They knew how to find true north without compasses. They understood how weight would settle across a large stone structure, and they understood how the ground beneath them would need to be shaped to support the load. All of this speaks to more than experience. It speaks to coordinated planning. This coordinated planning becomes even more intriguing when you consider the relationship between the pyramids themselves. They aren't scattered randomly across the plateau. They follow a pattern. Their bases align with certain geological lines. Their positions appear to respond to the natural bedrock. If you look at the plateau from above, the placement of the pyramids looks almost intentional in relation to the contours of the landscape. And because the builders shaped the bedrock in ways that appear purposeful, it suggests they were planning the project on a scale that extended well beyond the visible structures. Modern engineers know that before constructing large buildings, you need detailed surveys. You need to know the strength of the ground, the angle of the bedrock, the presence of natural cavities, and the structural risks. Ancient Egyptian builders seem to have done exactly that. They used the natural layers of limestone in the plateau as part of their support system. They selected areas where the ground was naturally strong. They avoided areas where soft layers could compromise stability. And in some places they even reinforced weaker regions by adding filling stones or reshaping the surface. If you imagine an ancient engineering team standing on the plateau thousands of years ago, planning the construction of the pyramids, it becomes easier to see how these structures may not be isolated objects. They may be pieces of a broader architectural blueprint. A blueprint that includes the ground, the stone, the air around the structures, and possibly the unseen layers below. The builders would have needed to consider all of this in order to create monuments that would endure for millennia. And their planning appears so meticulous that it hints at something unusual. These structures may have been designed to outlast not only their creators, but entire civilizations. When you look closely at the stones themselves, you notice something else. Many of the blocks used in the pyramids are uniform in size. They were cut with surprising regularity. This uniformity allowed the builders to create foundational layers that distributed the weight evenly. It also suggests a system of prefabrication, at least in a basic form. Quarry workers weren't cutting random blocks and hoping they'd fit. They were shaping them precisely, knowing exactly how each piece would be used. And the dimensional consistency hints at standardized measurements, something essential for large-scale construction. This raises a question. If the builders used standard measurements for the visible structure, did they also use them for the underground components? Were the same units applied to the shafts, chambers and trenches carved into the bedrock? Some researchers believe they were. Certain underground features matched the dimensions of above-ground features closely enough that coincidence seems unlikely. If the architects used shared units both above and below the surface, then the underground regions weren't afterthoughts. They were part of the plan. Ancient engineering wasn't just about stone, it was about understanding forces. The builders of the pyramids had a remarkable grasp of how weight travels through solid material. The internal chambers of the Great Pyramid are protected by huge granite beams, positioned in layers that redirect the weight of millions of tons of limestone. If those beams had been placed incorrectly, even by a small amount, the chambers would have collapsed under the pressure long ago. That they remain intact today is evidence of extraordinary precision. This level of precision becomes even more noteworthy when you consider how little margin for error the builders had. They couldn't correct mistakes with modern tools. They couldn't model the entire structure on a computer. They had to rely on measurement, observation, geometry, and experience passed down through generations. They had to understand the way stone behaves under stress, and they had to predict how the structure would change over decades, centuries, and millennia. This kind of long-term thinking is rare in ancient architecture. Most cultures built for the present. The Egyptians built for eternity. The planning didn't stop with the Great Pyramid. The Khafra and Menkaure pyramids show similar levels of precision and similar relationships between the structure and the ground. Their alignments match. Their orientations match. Their internal angles match. This consistency suggests shared planning principles, shared engineering methods, shared blueprints, not literal paper blueprints, but mental and practical frameworks that extended across generations of builders. These frameworks guided how structures were placed, how foundations were shaped, how underground spaces were carved. What's fascinating is that some of the underground features don't match the final structure in a direct way. They appear older, deeper, or different in form. This suggests that some parts of the underground system may predate the visible pyramids or represent stages in construction that weren't completed. It's also possible that certain underground elements were meant to serve long-forgotten functions: water storage, resource control, construction logistics, ceremony? We don't know. But we can say with confidence that the ground wasn't shaped randomly. It was shaped according to a plan, one we don't fully understand yet. One of the more intriguing clues appears in the trenches carved into the plateau. Some of these trenches mirror the shape of the pyramids themselves, as if marking out space for a structure before construction. Others form long straight lines that could have been guides for alignment. Still others lead to entrances of underground corridors that were later filled or buried. These features suggest that the builders didn't treat the plateau as blank ground. They treated it as a working surface, a grid, a blueprint drawn in stone. Think about the scale of such a project. Hundreds of thousands of stones, workers coordinated across years, resources transported over long distances, all of it under the direction of planners who had to predict outcomes with remarkable accuracy. The blueprint for the pyramids wasn't just architectural, it was logistical, social, economic, cultural. It required a level of organisation that suggests something larger than a single purpose. And when you view it from that angle, the idea of the pyramids being only the upper portion of a larger system begins to seem less like speculation and more like a natural extension of the engineering mindset. Another element worth considering is the relationship between the pyramids and the Nile. The river wasn't just a source of water, it was a transportation route. It allowed stone to be brought from quarries many kilometres away, but it also seems to have influenced the orientation of the site. The builders placed the pyramids in alignment with celestial directions, but they also positioned them relative to the river's course. The combination of land and sky markers suggests a dual system blueprint, one that ties the architecture to both the earth and the heavens. This duality is reflected in many ancient Egyptian concepts: above and below, seen and unseen, surface and depth. If the pyramids reflect this duality, then it would make sense that the ground beneath them holds as much intention as the visible stones. Ancient engineers often built downward to mirror upward construction. Tombs descended beneath temples, storage chambers extended below workshops, trenches guided the flow of water and resources. The plateau may follow this pattern as well, with buried features reflecting the organisation of the structures above. Early surveyors noted signs of large underground halls near the pyramids. They described smooth walls, square corners, and unexpectedly spacious areas. Later excavations confirmed the presence of some of these features, though many remain sealed or unexplored. The consistency in their construction suggests they weren't random or improvised. They were planned. More importantly, they seem to follow a blueprint that extends horizontally across the plateau, rather than vertically beneath one structure. This means the engineering plan may have involved connecting multiple underground spaces into a network beneath the entire complex. When you combine all of these clues, the careful alignment, the carved bedrock, the consistent measures, the underground anomalies, the trench patterns, the geological adaptations, you begin to see the outline of something. Not a dramatic secret, not a hidden civilization, something more grounded, a blueprint drawn not on paper but in stone, a blueprint that uses the natural landscape as part of the design, a blueprint that integrates the visible and the unseen. And once you accept that such a blueprint likely existed, the next question becomes more interesting. If the ancient engineers were planning on such a large scale, what exactly were they planning? What purpose drove the combination of above-ground monuments and underground features? What were they trying to achieve? What did they need the plateau to do that the structures alone could not? When you imagine the inside of a pyramid, you might picture a few narrow corridors, a couple of chambers, and then solid stone stretching outward in every direction. That's the simplified version most of us learn when we're young. A pyramid is supposed to be a mostly solid mass with a handful of carefully designed interior spaces. In theory, these features are meant to be predictable: a descending passage, an ascending passage, a central chamber or two, a ventilation shaft, a few small niches, and then nothing else. The official descriptions of the pyramids often rely on this straightforward model. But once researchers began looking more deeply, sometimes literally, into the structures, they found details that didn't fit the model. Rooms that weren't supposed to be there. Tunnels that extended farther than they should. Features cut into the bedrock that didn't line up with any known phase of construction. These are the parts of the pyramids that make people pause. None of this means the structures are mysterious in a supernatural sense. It simply means they contain more complexity than the standard diagrams suggest. Anyone who has worked on old buildings knows that blueprints don't always reflect reality. Renovations change things. Structural adjustments change things. The intentions of earlier builders can leave marks that later builders decide to cover up, repurpose, or abandon. What makes the pyramids interesting is that they were built on such a massive scale by multiple generations of workers over long spans of time. This leaves plenty of room for unexpected features, but some of these features feel too deliberate to be construction leftovers and too carefully shaped to be natural formations. They suggest an underlying intention that wasn't fully documented in the visible architecture. The first of these unexpected spaces appeared in early explorations of the Great Pyramid. When researchers descended into the lower chamber, they encountered a rough, unfinished room cut deep into the bedrock. The walls were not smooth the way finished chambers usually are. The ceiling was uneven. The floor had strange recesses and channels carved into it. At first, people assumed this chamber was abandoned during construction, but the more it was studied, the less that explanation made sense. The walls, while rough, were not random. The recesses appeared deliberate. Some channels were straight, others were angled, and none of it lined up neatly with the layout of the upper chambers. If it were only this chamber, it might be easy to dismiss. But it isn't the only case. Above the king's chamber, there are several smaller spaces known as relieving chambers. For centuries, no one knew they existed because they were sealed off. Their purpose was explained as reducing pressure on the chamber below. That explanation is reasonable and likely true, but the existence of multiple hidden chambers raises a question. If these spaces were purely structural, why were they built with such precision? Why were they sealed so thoroughly? And why did the builders take the trouble to give them such uniform dimensions? Later investigations revealed something even stranger. In the 19th century, explorers found tunnels branching off known corridors. Tunnels that led nowhere or ended abruptly in solid stone. Some of these tunnels appeared too cleanly carved to be natural. Others were filled with rubble that shouldn't have been there if they were simple construction shafts. In some cases, the tunnels were so narrow that the only possible explanation was that they were used for measurement, alignment, or temporary access during early phases of construction. But their placement didn't always line up with the final design of the pyramid. This suggests that at least some of the tunnels belong to earlier planning stages that may have included ideas or layouts that were later modified or abandoned. When modern scanning technologies were applied to the pyramids, even more anomalies appeared. A large cavity was detected above the Grand Gallery in the Great Pyramid. Not a small void, but a significant space, long, tall, and completely unknown until recently. This space doesn't appear in any construction descriptions. It doesn't match any known chamber, and its purpose is still unclear. Some researchers think it might be a relieving space similar to the chambers above the king's chamber. Others think it might be a remnant of an earlier internal layout. Still others believe it may have been intentionally hidden. But what matters is that it exists, and its existence adds another layer to the idea that the pyramids contain more than the simplified models imply. The same is true for the Khafra pyramid. Scans have shown that beneath its surface, there are areas where the density changes unexpectedly. These variations suggest cavities or tunnels, but the exact shapes are difficult to determine. Some might be natural pockets in the limestone, others might be carved spaces that were never completed, but a few show patterns of straight lines or right angles. Those are harder to explain as natural features. Straight lines in geology usually indicate human activity, And when those lines occur beneath a structure as carefully planned as a pyramid, they become especially interesting. There are also old accounts of explorers finding underground passages near the Sphinx that extended farther than expected. Some of these accounts describe long corridors leading beneath the plateau. Others mention rooms carved into the bedrock. A few reports even suggest that certain entrances were sealed long before modern archaeologists arrived. Many of these descriptions come from a time when documentation was inconsistent, so not all of them can be verified, but some were later confirmed by controlled excavations. Those confirmations don't prove the existence of vast networks. They do, however, show that more underground features exist than early maps indicated. One of the more unusual examples is a deep shaft found near the Great Pyramid, lined with cut stone walls. The shaft descends vertically and then appears to branch horizontally. When first discovered, it was filled with debris. Later excavations cleared parts of it, revealing smooth surfaces that suggested careful construction. But the purpose of the shaft remains unknown. It doesn't align with known burial practices. It doesn't appear to be a simple ventilation route. And its depth suggests a level of effort that would not have been undertaken without a reason. Whether that reason was practical, ceremonial, or logistical is still a matter of debate. Another enigmatic feature appears beneath the Menkore pyramid. Early surveys identified what seemed to be a chamber beneath the surface. Later studies confirmed the chamber and revealed unusual stonework inside it. The walls were cut in a way that didn't match typical burial chamber patterns. The ceiling shape was unusual, and the floor had carved recesses that looked like placeholders for something. But no artifacts were found, no inscriptions, no clear indication of the chamber's purpose. It exists, cleanly cut, precisely shaped, and empty. This kind of emptiness can be more compelling than a room full of objects. It invites questions. Why carve such a space? Why leave it bare? Why seal it so completely that it remained hidden for centuries? These examples, unexpected rooms, unexplained tunnels, uncharted cavities, don't suggest anything fantastical. They suggest complexity. They suggest phases of construction that evolved over time. They suggest layers of planning that responded to geological conditions, construction challenges, and perhaps intentions that weren't recorded. When builders work on a project for decades or generations, their designs change. Their priorities shift. They refine their methods. Sometimes they start cutting a passage only to realize later that it's no longer needed. Other times, they create a chamber for a purpose that later generations don't understand. The pyramids were not built in a single moment. They were built through processes, and those processes left traces. What makes these traces compelling is how deliberate some of them feel. A room carved with precision suggests intentional planning, not improvisation. A tunnel cut with straight lines suggests direction, not accident. A chamber sealed so thoroughly that modern technology barely detects, it suggests an intention for permanence, not convenience. And when multiple such features appear across different pyramids, a pattern emerges. A pattern not of hidden secrets, but of layered design. It's easy to imagine ancient builders working from a blueprint that included elements both above and below the surface. But a blueprint of this scale wouldn't have been a single plan. It would have evolved. Some parts would have been adjusted, some would have been cancelled, some would have been repurposed, and some would have been completed even if their purpose wasn't fully clear by the final phase of construction. This happens in large modern projects too. Buildings contain spaces that are never used. Tunnels lead to abandoned areas. Rooms get closed off. But in ancient structures, where documentation was limited and oral knowledge faded over time, these unused or repurposed features become mysteries. That's where the quiet intrigue of the pyramids lies. Not in the idea of secret chambers designed to hide unimaginable things, but in the simple realization that the builders were doing more than constructing monuments. They were shaping the ground. They were marking the bedrock. They were carving spaces that followed patterns we haven't fully decoded. And those spaces, now hidden beneath thousands of years of dust and sand, tell a story of ambition that extended downward as much as upward. When you walk across the plateau today, the surface seems stable, but beneath your feet is a layered environment. Some layers are natural, some are carved, some have been filled, some remain hollow, and each of these layers contributes to the idea that the structures we see are only one part of a larger whole. The rooms that weren't supposed to exist, the tunnels that stretch farther than expected, the cavities that appear in scans but remain unexplored, they all point to a quieter, less visible version of the pyramids, a version that isn't as polished or symmetrical as the stones above ground, a version shaped by practical needs, evolving plans, and the hands of workers who are guided by architects we may never fully understand. Thinking about these hidden spaces doesn't change the purpose of the pyramids, it deepens it. It reminds us that ancient engineering was rarely one-dimensional. It involved adaptation, trial, and refinement. It involved shaping both the space we see and the space we don't. When people speak about the Giza Plateau, they almost always describe what rises above it. The outlines of the pyramids in the morning light, the long shadows they cast as the sun begins to set, the way the structures seem to press upward into the sky as if competing silently with the horizon. But if you shift your attention downward and imagine what lies beneath the surface, the image becomes more layered. The plateau is not an empty shelf of limestone waiting to support the weight of the pyramids. It is a deep, irregular structure full of pockets, ridges, faults, and in some places, open spaces. These open spaces have played a quiet role in shaping the theories, questions, and speculations that surround the site. Not because they imply something sensational, but because they remind us that the earth beneath Giza is far more complicated than a simple foundation. The geological story of the area begins long before humans arrived. Tens of millions of years ago, the region that is now desert was once underwater. Over time, layers of sediment built up. Some layers hardened into limestone that was strong and dense. Other layers formed softer pockets that could be eroded by ancient waterways. These natural processes left behind a landscape with subtle internal variation. In some places, the limestone is uniform. In others, it contains fissures or cavities formed by the movement of groundwater. When the land eventually rose and dried, these cavities remained. Most are small, some are larger, a few are interconnected. They form a kind of natural architecture beneath the plateau, one that existed long before the idea of a pyramid ever entered anyone's mind. If you were to walk across the plateau knowing this history, you might imagine the ground as a series of layers, some solid, some hollow, some smooth, some fractured. You wouldn't see any of this from the surface. The sand conceals it, the rock hides it. But the presence of natural cavities is undeniable. They are part of the geological profile of the region, and their existence raises a basic question. When ancient builders began shaping the plateau, how much of this natural structure did they encounter? How much did they use? How much did they reinforce or expand? Archaeologists have found evidence that some natural cavities were modified. Walls were smoothed, ceilings were trimmed, entrances were widened. In other cases, workers carved entirely new spaces in areas where the rock was soft enough to allow it. This combination of natural and artificial shaping is common in ancient construction. Builders gravitated toward places where the landscape offered assistance. If a natural cavity provided a starting point, they used it. If the bedrock was weak in a certain area, they avoided it. But when these choices are applied to a site as significant as Giza, their implications expand. Natural caves and chambers become part of the architectural picture, even if unintentionally. One of the most frequently mentioned features beneath the plateau is a large natural cavity located not far from the Great Pyramid. Early explorers wrote about entering a space that seemed unusually open compared to the surrounding terrain. The descriptions vary. Some accounts mention a chamber with a high ceiling. Others describe branching passages. The accuracy of these early reports is difficult to confirm, but later surveys did identify voids in the area. Whether these voids match the ones described by explorers is unclear. but the presence of large underground spaces suggests that the plateau was not entirely solid when construction began. There are other cavities as well, smaller ones scattered across the area. Some appear in seismic surveys, others in microgravity maps. Some have been explored, many haven't. The difficulty lies in accessing them without damaging the surface structures. Excavating beneath a pyramid is not something researchers take lightly. A single miscalculation could destabilize the foundation. Because of this, many cavities remain unexamined, preserved simply because accessing them would pose too great a risk. These unexplored spaces naturally attract attention. People wonder what lies inside. They wonder whether the cavities connect to the known chambers within the pyramids. They wonder whether ancient builders used these spaces intentionally. And because the information is incomplete, theories begin to form. Some theories are modest, others stretch farther. But they all begin with the same basic question. If there are natural cavities beneath the plateau, what did the builders know about them? Ancient Egyptians were skilled at reading landscapes. They knew how to find stable ground. They understood how rock behaved under weight. It's reasonable to assume that they would have encountered some of these cavities during construction. They may have reinforced the rock around them. They may have filled some with stone. They may have connected others to their own carved spaces. And if they found a cavity that extended farther than expected, it might have influenced how they shaped the ground above. Builders planning structures of such size would not have left anything to chance. They would have assessed the terrain carefully, adjusting their designs as needed. As you imagine this process, it becomes easy to picture ancient workers entering natural cavities with torches, examining the rock, deciding what needed to be carved or filled. This image doesn't require invention, it follows from practical necessity. But in the centuries that followed, those cavities might have been forgotten. Sand could have filled the entrances. Shifts in the ground could have sealed the passages. Later generations would have lost access to them, leaving no written record of their existence. And because the pyramids themselves became the focus of cultural attention, the world above ground overshadowed the world below. This is where whispered theories begin. Not because people are trying to imagine impossible things, but because they are trying to reconcile the geological reality with the archaeological one. The ground beneath Giza contains natural cavities. It contains carved spaces. It contains sealed chambers and unexplored voids. And when a site contains many features that cannot be fully mapped, curiosity grows naturally. Some theories suggest that ancient builders chose the plateau specifically because of its geology. The natural cavities could have been viewed as opportunities to create complex underground spaces without needing to carve everything from scratch. Others propose that the cavities were incorporated into ritual practices or symbolic concepts. Still others think the cavities might have been used to manage groundwater during construction. These ideas don't rely on extraordinary claims. They rely on practical considerations. Builders often adapt natural features to serve their needs. There is another aspect to consider. The plateau has been used for thousands of years. Different periods introduced different modifications. Some chambers beneath the surface may belong to earlier settlements. Others may have been added long after the pyramids were built. When researchers explore beneath the plateau, they sometimes find features that don't match the style or methods of the Old Kingdom. This suggests that the underground landscape was shaped not just by the pyramid builders, but by multiple generations. Each left traces that blend together, creating a layered history beneath the sand. This layered history encourages speculation, especially when features appear in locations that don't correspond neatly to known phases of construction. For example, some tunnels beneath the plateau run in directions that suggest they were meant to connect different parts of the complex, but their entrances are sealed and their paths are incomplete. They might be remnants of earlier plans, or they might have been abandoned halfway through. Without full access, it's hard to know. Then there are theories that stretch beyond practicality. Theories of vast underground complexes. Theories of ancient archives hidden deep beneath the surface. theories of networks that extend farther than the boundaries of the plateau. These ideas often arise not from evidence but from absence, an absence of complete information. When technology detects a void but cannot determine what fills it, the mind supplies possibilities. Most of these possibilities remain unproven, but the voids themselves are real, and the uncertainty surrounding them fuels quiet speculation. The reality is likely more grounded. The underground landscape of Giza is probably a mixture of natural caves, ancient construction shafts, unfinished passages, and a handful of chambers created for specific purposes we no longer understand. These features coexist beneath the surface in a complex pattern that researchers are still trying to map. And the more they investigate, the more they find that the plateau is anything but uniform. In recent years, microgravity surveys have supported the idea that multiple cavities beneath the plateau are interconnected, not necessarily in a continuous tunnel system, but in a geological sense. The natural cavities form a loose network, created by the erosion of softer limestone layers. Some of these cavities may lie close enough to carved spaces that distinguishing between natural and artificial becomes challenging. When scans show an anomaly, researchers have to interpret whether it represents a chamber, a fault, or a combination of both. This difficulty is one reason the theories persist, not because the theories are required, but because the evidence is incomplete. The plateau keeps parts of its structure hidden. The sand fills spaces the tools cannot reach. The rock absorbs signals that would otherwise reveal details, and the pyramids themselves limit the extent to which researchers can explore the ground beneath them. Imagine standing on the plateau at night, when the temperature drops and the wind moves softly across the sand. The ground beneath your feet feels solid, but somewhere below there may be empty spaces, some known, some unknown, some ancient, some accidental. You can't see them, you can't hear them, but you can imagine them, not in a dramatic sense, but in a quiet, steady way. The earth beneath Giza holds layers of history compacted into stone. Some layers are geological, some are architectural, some exist only in hints and shadows on scanning equipment, and that brings you to the heart of this subject. The theories whisper not because they are meant to shock, but because the plateau leaves enough room for questions to linger, enough room for the imagination to wonder how the builders interacted with the landscape, enough room for researchers to acknowledge that they are still learning how the underground environment shapes the structures above. If you stand anywhere on the Giza plateau and look toward the pyramids, one thing becomes clear almost immediately. Their placement is not casual, their angles are not careless. Their positions relative to one another feel deliberate in a way that becomes more noticeable the longer you look. The more carefully you examine the layout of the pyramids, the harder it becomes to see them as isolated structures. Instead, they begin to suggest a kind of alignment, one that involves not just the stars, not just the cardinal directions, but something grounded in the land itself, something deeper. People often talk about the alignment of the pyramids with astonishing admiration. The fact that the sides of the Great Pyramid are almost perfectly aligned with true north is something that still impresses engineers today. The precision of that alignment is difficult to achieve even with modern tools. Yet the builders accomplished it using observations of the sky, measurements of shadows, and a level of patience that is difficult to imagine. They weren't simply building a tomb. They were orienting a structure so carefully that its angles would hold true for thousands of years. This orientation wasn't an accident, and it wasn't unique to the Great Pyramid. The other large pyramids at Giza follow the same directional pattern. Their sides face the same cardinal directions. Their angles relate to one another through consistent geometric relationships. When viewed from above, the three pyramids form a layout with a rhythm to it, one that reflects a combination of engineering, astronomy, and a deep understanding of how structures interact with the landscape. But the connection to astronomy is only part of the picture. Many discussions tend to stop there, focusing on how the builders use the stars to find true north, or how certain shafts align with specific celestial objects. These details are interesting, but they also create a narrow expectation. that the builders were only concerned with what lies above. Yet ancient Egyptian architecture shows a consistent pattern of connecting the sky to the earth. Temples were aligned not just with celestial markers, but also with geographic features. Structures were oriented based on the path of the Nile, the rising of the sun, and the relationships between settlements. The pyramids fit this pattern. Their alignment is not purely celestial, it is environmental. To understand this, imagine standing on the plateau before construction began. The land slopes gently in some areas and sharply in others. The bedrock rises and falls. Certain ridges run in predictable lines. These ridges formed long before humans shaped the ground, and some run parallel to the orientation of the pyramids. Ancient builders would have noticed this. They would have mapped the natural lines of the land just as carefully as they mapped the stars. And when you map both, you begin to see something interesting. The orientation that aligns the pyramids with true north is also the orientation that aligns them with the strongest, most stable lines in the underlying bedrock. This matters because building such heavy structures requires more than vertical balance. It requires horizontal stability. If the builders had misaligned the pyramids with the natural patterns of the plateau, the ground beneath them might have shifted under the weight. But by aligning the structures both to the cardinal directions and to the geological structure beneath the surface, the builders created a harmonized system. The surface layout reflects the sky, the stability reflects the earth, and the combined alignment allows the pyramids to behave the way they do, immovable, balanced, and enduring. There is also the matter of the relationship between the pyramids themselves. If they were built as separate projects without shared plans, their positioning would likely differ, but their layout suggests coordination. The spacing between them follows geometric proportions that repeat when measured in different ways. This is true horizontally, in the distances between their bases, and vertically, in the angles formed by their slopes. Even the heights of the pyramids seem to relate to one another through proportional relationships. When you analyze these proportions, they look like part of a larger pattern rather than isolated decisions. Researchers who study ancient surveying methods have suggested that the builders may have used a grid, one laid out across the plateau long before construction began. This grid could have guided the placement of the pyramids, the orientation of the causeways, the alignment of temples, and the shaping of the surrounding ground. If such a grid existed, it would represent a level of pre-construction planning rare in ancient architecture. And while the idea is still debated, there is one compelling piece of evidence supporting it. Many structures on the plateau appear to align not just with celestial markers, but with each other. The causeway of the Khafra pyramid, for example, aligns with specific angles both to its pyramid and to the Sphinx. The Sphinx aligns with the sunrise at specific times of the year. The valley temples align with the causeways. The satellite pyramids align with the main pyramids through consistent spacing patterns. When you place all of these alignments on a single map, the image becomes crowded with lines, shapes, and intersections. Yet these lines do not overlap randomly. They form a pattern, a kind of silent diagram that stretches across the plateau. Some people interpret this pattern purely as aesthetic or symbolic, but there is reason to consider a more practical side. Such a layout could make the entire complex more stable, allowing the builders to distribute weight, shape the ground, and manage construction on a massive scale. Ancient engineers understood that large structures require coordinated planning. And when a site contains multiple massive structures, that planning becomes increasingly important. This brings us to a question that sits quietly at the base of most discussions about alignment. If the pyramids were aligned so carefully above ground, is it possible that the alignment continues below? Were underground features positioned to match the same geometric principles as the surface structures? It is difficult to say with certainty because much of the underground layout remains unexplored, but the features that have been mapped show surprising consistency. Tunnels beneath the plateau often run in straight lines, chambers align with the centres of the pyramids, shafts drop vertically at locations that relate to the structural grid of the upper levels. When scans reveal new voids, Their positions sometimes fall along lines connected to known structures. Not perfectly, but closely enough to raise questions. If these underground spaces were carved at random, their alignment would not matter. But the consistency suggests that at least some were positioned intentionally, and if that is the case, then the alignment that governs the visible pyramids might also govern the hidden ones. There is another aspect to consider. The builders of the pyramids seem to value redundancy. They created multiple chambers above the king's chamber to distribute weight. They added structural features that were not visible to anyone using the pyramid. They built shafts that had no easy access. This suggests a mindset focused on long-term stability and hidden infrastructure. If that mindset extended downward, it is possible that underground features were positioned to mirror or support the structures above. Take the relieving chambers, for example. Their existence shows that the builders understood how forces move through stone. They created spaces above the chamber not to store anything, but to shape the way weight travels downward. If they were willing to carve hidden chambers above the main chamber for structural purposes, it isn't unreasonable to think they might have carved hidden chambers below for the same reason. The alignment of the upper features could guide the layout of the lower features, creating a continuous system of structural management. Some researchers have noticed that the known internal passages of the pyramids align almost exactly on a central axis that extends downward into the bedrock. This central axis could act as a kind of spine, supporting both the visible structure and any underground components. If such a spine exists, then the alignment of the pyramids becomes more than aesthetic or symbolic. It becomes a structural necessity, a way of integrating the architecture with the geology to ensure stability for thousands of years. This integration opens the door to a subtle possibility. If the builders were using alignment to stabilize the visible structures, they may have used alignment to stabilize underground spaces as well. This doesn't imply a vast hidden world beneath the plateau. It implies continuity, a consistent engineering philosophy applied both above and below the ground. A philosophy that sees alignment as a tool for shaping the landscape in a way that suits the architectural goals. As you imagine the landscape in this way, the idea of alignment shifts. It becomes less about pointing to the stars and more about anchoring the structures in the earth. The pyramids may point upward, but they also anchor downward. Their alignment stabilizes the ground beneath them. It organizes the layout of surrounding structures. It influences the way the site ages, the way the sand gathers, and the way the bedrock responds to weight. The more carefully you look at this system, the easier it becomes to see the pyramids as part of something interconnected rather than isolated. There are still parts of the alignment story that remain unexplained. Some features match the layout perfectly, others do not. Some corridors curve unexpectedly. Some shafts end abruptly. Some causeways deviate by a few degrees. These variations can be frustrating if you try to force every detail into a single theory. But they often reflect the realities of construction. Builders adjust plans as they go. They respond to problems in the bedrock. They revise their ideas based on new information. Large projects rarely follow a perfect pattern, even when they appear precise from a distance. The key is not to view alignment as a rigid system, but as a guiding principle. A principle that shaped the visible layout, influenced the underground layout, and tied the entire complex together through shared angles, shared ratios, and shared orientations. This kind of planning doesn't require modern technology. It requires patience, observation, and knowledge accumulated over generations. And those qualities are exactly what ancient Egyptian builders possessed. For as long as people have looked at the pyramids, they've tried to imagine what might lie beneath them. Long before scanners and surveys and precise measurements, the earliest stories about Giza already included ideas of hidden passages, secret chambers, and vast underground realms. These stories didn't come from nowhere. They were attempts to interpret the landscape using whatever information people had at the time, filtered through their cultural beliefs and their sense of what a monument of this size might contain. Over generations, the stories grew, shifted, and attached themselves to the structures in ways that survived, even as the civilizations that created them faded. What's interesting is not whether these stories are literal, it's how consistently they point in the same direction, downward. Ancient Egyptians rarely wrote openly about the internal workings of sacred sites. Much of their knowledge was reserved for priests, scribes, and builders. This silence left room for stories to grow around the pyramids. The earliest legends recorded by Greek visitors describe the pyramids almost as living structures, full of sealed corridors, hidden rooms, and carefully guarded pathways. These accounts often emphasize the idea that the pyramids contained knowledge stored in concealed locations beneath the ground. Greek historians weren't shy about weaving imagination into their reports, but they also recorded what Egyptian guides told them, and those guides often hinted at underground features even when they didn't describe them in detail. One of the earliest stories comes from Herodotus, who wrote that the builders of the pyramids created elaborate underground chambers that were connected to the Nile. According to his account, a canal flowed beneath the Great Pyramid, linking the interior to the river. Most modern scholars doubt the full details of this claim, but what matters is that ancient Egyptians themselves, or at least the people guiding Herodotus, believed in or spoke about subterranean architecture. The idea of rooms beneath the pyramids wasn't a later invention. It existed even in antiquity. Later writers expanded on these themes. Some described labyrinthine structures beneath the plateau. Others wrote of chambers filled with scrolls, tools, treasures, or writings meant to preserve knowledge through catastrophes. A few accounts claim that the underground areas were intentionally sealed to protect their contents from floods, invaders, or the erosion of time. These descriptions are often exaggerated, but they consistently mention carved spaces beneath the surface. Even if the stories grew over time, their foundations likely come from something real. Observations of shafts, depressions, or entrances that hinted at a deeper environment beneath the pyramids. Myths from the medieval period added another layer. Travellers from the Middle East wrote about secret doors hidden in the bedrock. Some stories suggested that tunnels beneath the plateau extended for miles. Others described chambers guarded by mechanical devices or traps. These stories often reflect the imagination of their time, blending spiritual beliefs with architectural speculation. But even through the embellishments, one consistent detail remains: the belief that the pyramids are only the surface of something larger. It's tempting to dismiss all of this as imagination. But myths often arise from kernels of truth, even when the details drift into fiction. If people repeatedly encountered signs of underground spaces, blocked entrances, shafts descending into darkness, unnatural depressions in the ground, they would naturally try to make sense of them. And in a time when written records were limited, myth served as a way to pass information across generations. There is also the way that legends form around places that inspire awe. Large structures tend to attract stories. People fill in the unknown with whatever explanations they can create. The bigger the unknown, the bigger the story. The pyramids sit in that space perfectly, standing between the visible and the hidden. The stories don't persist only because they're dramatic. They persist because they match the instincts people feel when looking at these structures. They look incomplete, as if what we see is only the beginning. Some ancient legends focus on something even more specific: the idea that the pyramids were built to protect knowledge from disaster, floods, fires, or catastrophic events. The notion is not historically accurate in the way the stories describe it, but it may reflect something simpler. Ancient societies often believed that important knowledge should be stored in durable structures. What is more durable than a pyramid? If people saw workers entering or exiting underground spaces during construction, the idea that these spaces held knowledge or served protective functions would have made sense. Then there are the stories tied to the Sphinx. Many legends describe tunnels beneath it. People claim there were doorways beneath the pores, chambers beneath the body, or passages that extended toward the pyramids. Early explorers searched for these features and sometimes reported finding small cavities or blocked entrances. Later, Archaeological work confirmed that there are indeed natural and carved spaces around and beneath the Sphinx enclosure. Not vast halls, but features that match the basic shape of the legends. Enough to keep the stories alive. Enough to suggest that the myths, while exaggerated, had some observational basis. As centuries passed, these legends spread far beyond Egypt. Medieval scholars in Europe wrote about underground libraries. Renaissance writers speculated about concealed chambers filled with wisdom from the world's earliest civilizations. Even modern researchers, influenced by the imaginative layers of the past, sometimes wonder if underground areas might hold traces of earlier construction phases or storage spaces left behind by workers. Of course, modern science approaches these ideas more cautiously, but even cautious approaches acknowledge that the underground environment at Giza is not fully understood. When myths survive for thousands of years, it's rarely because they remain unchallenged. They survive because new discoveries continue to echo parts of their stories. When a previously unknown cavity is found beneath a pyramid, it doesn't confirm the myth, but it reminds people why the myth formed in the first place. When scanning equipment detects unexpected voids, it reinforces the idea that the plateau might hold secrets simply because it hasn't been fully explored. What makes this subject compelling is how well the myths align with what we know about human nature. People use stories to navigate uncertainty. When a place contains visible features that hint at invisible ones, myths fill the gaps. When the pyramids show precision above ground and mysteries below, stories begin to connect the two. The myths become maps, not literal maps, but ways of imagining the hidden landscape. In some ways, the myths act as an early form of theorizing. Before archaeology existed, stories offered frameworks for thinking about the unknown. People weren't trying to mislead, they were trying to interpret. They saw entrances cut into the bedrock and assumed they led somewhere significant. They found blocked tunnels and imagined what might be behind them. They noticed alignment between structures and wondered whether the same alignment extended underground. In this way, myth becomes less about invention and more about speculation based on observation. There is also the symbolic side of these stories. Ancient Egyptians often used symbolic language to describe sites. When they said something was beneath the earth, they didn't always mean it literally. They sometimes meant it belonged to the realm of the afterlife or the domain of the gods. Over time, symbolic language can be taken literally, especially by outside cultures. A story about knowledge hidden beneath the earth could easily become a story about physical chambers below the pyramids once it passed through enough generations. This blending of literal and symbolic language is one reason myths feel layered, as though they contain multiple meanings at once. When you consider all of this together, the natural features, the carved features, the partially explored spaces, the myths that persisted, and the discoveries that occasionally echo the stories, it becomes clear that the legends aren't just tales. They're reflections of the same instinct that drives modern exploration, the instinct to understand what lies beneath, the instinct to look at a structure as large as the Great Pyramid and assume that its size might continue downward in ways we don't yet know. The interesting thing is that as scanning technology improves, the myths don't necessarily fade. If anything, they shift. New voids detected beneath the surface create new questions. New anomalies spark new conversations. The legends adapt in subtle ways. Not because people expect fantasy, but because the plateau hasn't offered complete answers yet. The unknown remains. And as long as the unknown exists, stories will continue to fill the space between what we know and what we suspect. The more time you spend thinking about this, the more you begin to see the myths as part of the site's history rather than distractions from it. They represent thousands of years of interpretation, ideas passed down through cultures trying to make sense of a place that still inspires questions. The ground beneath the pyramids is uneven, complex, and largely inaccessible. Those qualities make it fertile ground for stories. but they also make it a place where partial truths can hide. Even modern researchers acknowledge that the underground structure of the plateau is something still being mapped, not because they expect dramatic discoveries, but because the geology, the carved features, and the layers of history create a puzzle that takes time to understand. The myths may exaggerate the scale, but they match the direction. They point downward. They match the instinct to see the pyramids as more than surfaces. When people look at the pyramids today, they often describe them as impossible. Not literally impossible, but close enough that the thought hangs in the background. It comes from a simple contrast. On one hand, the pyramids are enormous. They involve millions of stone blocks, precise alignments, complex internal chambers, and a scale of planning that stretches across decades. On the other hand, they were built without modern machinery, without advanced metallurgy, without digital measurement tools, and without the kinds of technologies that seem essential for projects of this scale. When modern engineers examine the pyramids, they sometimes admit that recreating them with exact historical methods would be difficult. Not impossible, but unfamiliar, and that unfamiliarity creates space for questions. These questions aren't born from disbelief. They come from trying to reconcile what we know about ancient tools with what we see in the finished structures. When you walk along the base of a pyramid and look up at the sheer volume of stone, you understand the physical effort required. When you examine the precise angles, you understand the mathematical knowledge required. When you look at the internal chambers and how they were cut into both stone and bedrock, you understand the engineering required. Each part of the structure reflects a different set of skills. Together, they form something that seems beyond the reach of simple tools, even though simple tools were exactly what the builders had. The natural conclusion people reach is that the builders possessed a kind of practical technology that doesn't resemble modern machinery but achieved similar outcomes. Not advanced in the modern sense, but advanced within the context of their time. A blend of measurement, planning, and controlled labour that created results we struggle to replicate today without heavy equipment. This is where the technology question begins, not with fantasies about impossible machines, but with genuine curiosity about how the builders worked so efficiently and so precisely using methods we no longer practice at scale. The first aspect to consider is measurement. The accuracy of the pyramid's alignment with true north is astonishing. The builders achieved this alignment with remarkable consistency. The commonly suggested method involves tracking star movements, using a plumb line, and observing the position of shadows. These methods are simple in concept, but they require patience and repeated measurement. If the builders spent nights observing the sky, and days marking positions on the ground, they could achieve excellent precision. But this level of precision also implies organizational structure. People had to record information, pass it to teams, and ensure it remained consistent across the entire construction site. Next comes the question of stone cutting. The limestone blocks that form most of the pyramids could be carved with copper tools, stone hammers, and abrasion. Copper chisels needed constant resharpening, but with enough workers, maintenance could happen continuously. Granite blocks, used in the core of the Great Pyramid's internal structure, posed a greater challenge. Granite is far harder than limestone. Cutting it with copper alone would have been incredibly slow. Instead, the most likely method involved pounding stones, quartz sand abrasion, and simple but effective drilling techniques that combined rotation and pressure. These methods don't produce results quickly, but they produce results reliably. One of the biggest surprises for modern researchers is that ancient Egyptian builders used predictable, repeatable techniques that scale effectively when thousands of workers apply them simultaneously. A single copper chisel cutting granite is inefficient. Hundreds of tools used every day for years become something else entirely. A modern engineer may look for efficiency of individual tools. Ancient builders relied on efficiency of labour systems. The scale compensated for the limitations of the tools. Transporting the stones raises another set of questions. The common image of workers dragging blocks across the desert on wooden sleds is accurate but incomplete. Experiments show that sleds move more easily when the sand ahead is wetted. This reduces friction, allowing heavy stones to move with fewer people. Archaeologists found wall paintings showing workers pouring water in front of sleds, suggesting that this technique was known. Moving stones over ramps remains one of the more debated topics, but the simplest methods, straight ramps, zigzag ramps, or combinations of both, remain the most likely. Each has advantages and disadvantages, each requires enormous labour, but none are beyond plausibility when you consider the decades spent constructing a single pyramid. The precision inside the pyramids is another aspect that causes people to raise their eyebrows. The internal chambers involve straight lines, smooth surfaces, and tight joints between massive blocks. These features appear more advanced than what copper tools should allow, but the builders likely used harder stones to finish surfaces. Dolerite pounders are extremely effective for shaping hard stone. Rubbing blocks together with sand in between can produce a surface that feels surprisingly smooth. Measuring the internal angles with consistent tools, wooden squares, plumb lines, and string could produce carefully aligned passageways. The most intriguing part of this is how the builders maintained standardization across the site. They used consistent units of measurement. The cubit, for example, remained stable in length due to physical reference rods kept by officials. This ensured that even when blocks were cut in different quarries or shaped by different teams, they fit together correctly. It wasn't individual tools that made the difference. It was the system of measurement and the discipline that enforced it. Then there is the question of planning. Large construction projects today rely on detailed blueprints, models, and coordination. The pyramids likely had their own equivalent, maybe not on parchment or papyrus, but in the form of architectural layouts drawn on the ground, carved markers on bedrock, and instructions passed through high-ranking overseers. Partial diagrams found in tombs suggest that architects use simple sketches to plan structures. The precision of the pyramids implies they had more extensive plans than what has survived. But this doesn't imply anything mysterious. Ancient records rarely survive unless carved into stone. Most planning materials were perishable. What makes the technology question especially interesting is that, even with all of these known methods, parts of the pyramid still seem difficult to explain. For example, how did they lift the largest granite beams into place? The beams above the king's chamber weigh tens of tons. Moving them into the chamber required coordination between ramps, levers, and manpower. The process would have been slow and dangerous, but slow and dangerous isn't the same thing as impossible. The builders likely used temporary supports, incremental lifting, and wooden frames to move the beams upward a few centimeters at a time. Over weeks or months, the beams could be raised to their intended positions. Modern simulations show that such techniques are feasible, but feasibility doesn't remove the sense of amazement. The fact that something can be done doesn't diminish the detail of how it was done, and the fact that we can barely scan parts of the pyramids today, due to thickness, density, or the limitations of ground-penetrating technology, adds a quiet irony. We struggle to examine the structure with machines that didn't exist when it was built. The builders created something so massive and so dense that even modern instruments have difficulty detecting the full layout. Yet the builders worked with nothing more than stone, metal, wood, rope, and mathematics. There's another aspect of this that often goes overlooked. The builders didn't need advanced technology to build the pyramids. They needed organization. They needed consistent food supplies, water, shelter, and tools for thousands of workers across decades. They needed administrative systems that could coordinate labor across seasons. They needed teams of surveyors, architects, stone cutters, transport workers, ramp builders, and supervisors. The technology behind the pyramids wasn't in the tools, it was in the system. A system smooth enough that it allowed the construction of structures so massive that modern scanning equipment has trouble seeing through them. This perspective helps make sense of features that look out of place today. Smooth tunnels, straight shafts, massive chambers hidden behind layers of stone. These features didn't require speculative technologies, they required persistence. When something took years to carve, the builders carved for years. When something required reshaping bedrock, they reshaped the bedrock. When something demanded precise alignment, they spent days measuring the same line until it was correct. The absence of machines didn't limit them. It simply meant they had to substitute repetition and manual labour for mechanical shortcuts. The more closely you look at the technology question, the more you see that the builders worked with constraints that forced them to think differently from modern engineers. Modern thinking emphasises efficiency. Ancient thinking emphasised reliability. Modern methods rely on machinery to reduce labour. Ancient methods relied on labour to compensate for limited tools. The results can look similar, but the processes differ completely. The pyramids don't demonstrate advanced machinery. They demonstrate advanced organisation. There's still another layer to consider. The deeper the pyramids extend through internal chambers, shafts and carved bedrock, the more impressive the planning becomes. It's one thing to stack stones accurately. It's another to carve descending passages at exact angles, and it's yet another to coordinate underground features with surface features in ways that maintain stability. The builders understood that underground chambers created structural weaknesses if not positioned correctly. They used relieving chambers, stepped cuts, and layered stone to ensure that pressure didn't collapse the internal spaces. These methods require an understanding of load distribution that resembles modern engineering principles. This is why some researchers describe the pyramids not simply as monuments, but as engineered landscapes. The builders didn't just place structures onto the ground. They integrated the ground into the structures. They carved the bedrock to prepare it. They aligned their designs with the geology. They reinforced weak areas. They used natural cavities where helpful and avoided them where harmful. This integration gives the pyramids a resilience that remains unmatched. Modern buildings need frequent maintenance. The pyramids have remained stable for thousands of years without it. All of this invites a larger reflection. When modern tools struggle to scan through the pyramids, it isn't because the structures are mysterious, it's because they are immense. They were built with such density that even advanced instruments struggle to penetrate their mass. And when instruments do detect voids, corridors, or anomalies, the discoveries feel surprising not because they contradict what we know, but because they remind us how much we still haven't seen. The builders didn't leave manuals, they didn't leave diagrams, they left stone. Stone that resists decay, resists erosion, and resists our best attempts to look inside. The technology question ultimately leads to a conclusion that feels grounded. The builders use simple tools in sophisticated ways. They replace machinery with coordinated labour. They replace written blueprints with practical planning. They replace mechanical precision with accumulated experience. And the combination of these elements created structures that feel advanced, not because of mysterious tools, but because of the consistency with which these methods were applied. The fact that we can barely scan parts of the pyramids today adds to the sense of quiet wonder, but it doesn't require extraordinary explanations. It simply highlights how unusual it is for an ancient structure to challenge modern equipment. When you start thinking about how the pyramids interact with the ground beneath them, it becomes difficult not to notice something unusual about the landscape itself. The Giza Plateau doesn't look like a place chosen randomly. It has a certain structure to it, a certain pattern of ridges, flats and layers that feel like they were selected with intention. If you stand at different points on the plateau and look around, the ground rises and falls in ways that seem to support the placement of the pyramids. Not in a symbolic sense, in a practical one. The more closely you examine the geological setting, the more the plateau begins to look like a natural foundation, prepared long before any stones were placed. And when you combine that with the way the builders carved into it, shaped it, and aligned their structures along its surfaces, the landscape starts to resemble something that was approached, almost as if it were part of the engineering plan itself. Geologists who study the plateau often describe it as layered limestone formed millions of years ago when the area was covered by shallow seas. Over time, sediment accumulated, solidified, and compressed into rock. Some layers became dense and strong, others formed with pockets of air or with softer textures. The result is a natural structure that isn't perfectly uniform. It contains natural rises where the limestone is strong. It contains depressions where erosion left softer material. It contains seams, channels, and ancient pathways carved by water long before humans ever stepped onto the land. This geological variety is what makes the plateau interesting from an engineering perspective. If you're going to build a heavy structure, you need stone that can bear the weight. And the Giza Plateau offers exactly that in several key areas. When the builders arrived, they would have recognized these qualities. Ancient Egyptians were skilled at reading landscapes. They understood rock. They quarried it, carved it, and studied its behavior over generations. They knew which layers would hold and which would crumble. They knew where the rock was strongest. They knew how to cut into it without destabilizing it. They were in many ways geologists without modern terminology. When they looked at the plateau, they weren't just selecting a place to build. They were selecting a place where the ground itself could participate in the structure. One of the clearest examples of this is the base of the Great Pyramid. Large portions of its foundation are not built from blocks. They are carved directly into the bedrock. This means the builders didn't treat the ground as something separate from the pyramid. They treated it as part of the foundation. They trimmed it, leveled it, and shaped it with precision. Some parts are cut so smoothly that modern researchers at first assumed they were built stones, but closer inspection shows that these are natural layers of limestone shaped intentionally to support the structure. This blending of carved bedrock and placed blocks creates a hybrid foundation that takes advantage of both natural solidity and engineered precision. If this occurred at only one pyramid, it might be considered an isolated technique, but the same pattern appears across the plateau. The Khafra pyramid, perched slightly higher than the Great Pyramid, also integrates the bedrock into its base. The Menkaure pyramid does as well, though in different ways. When you look at the cross-sections of the plateau, you see that the builders positioned each pyramid on a specific geological layer. Not just any layer, the strongest layers. The layers most resistant to erosion. The layers least affected by ancient water flow. This suggests a level of geological awareness that goes beyond simply picking a convenient site. It suggests that the builders understood that the plateau itself had to participate in supporting the structures. They weren't looking for a flat area, they were looking for a stable one, and the way they shaped the ground shows that they deliberately matched their architecture to the geological strengths beneath it. There are parts of the plateau that are less stable. Softer limestone fills certain regions. Natural cavities appear where ancient water once flowed. These cavities could compromise the weight distribution of a large structure, but noticeably the builders avoided placing their heaviest architecture on these weaker areas. They didn't build massive foundations over soft zones. They didn't place internal chambers near natural voids unless those voids were reinforced or filled. Even the causeways connecting the pyramids to their valley temples follow routes that avoid geological weaknesses. When you look at a geological map of the area and overlay the architecture, it's difficult not to notice how well the structures fit into the strongest parts of the terrain. This raises a natural question. How much of this was intentional, and how much was the result of builders adapting as they went? Builders of large ancient structures often started with an idea and adjusted it based on what they found beneath the surface. If they encountered soft stone, they shifted. If they found a cavity, they filled it or carved around it. But at Giza, the patterns feel too consistent to be incidental. The alignment of the pyramids follows a predictable geological line. The foundations match the strongest layers. The placement of temples and causeways follows routes compatible with the natural topography. It almost looks as though the builders surveyed the geology and then designed the complex to match what they found. And if that is the case, then the plateau becomes not just a location, but a carefully selected and optimized foundation. Some researchers have suggested that the ancient builders deliberately shaped parts of the plateau to achieve certain forms. They carved trenches, leveled surfaces, and removed large quantities of bedrock before construction. These modifications created smooth working platforms, but they also created geometric forms in the bedrock that mirror the structures above. Long rectangular cuts beneath the pyramids resemble reverse outlines of the buildings. Linear trenches follow the same directional patterns as the pyramid bases. These features show that the builders were not merely flattening the ground, they were using it as part of their layout. Imagine a large team of workers carving long straight lines into the bedrock, marking out the footprint of the structure that would rise above them. These lines could function as guides. They could serve as the earliest form of large-scale ground diagrams, and because they are cut directly into the limestone, they would survive thousands of years, even if covered by sand. Some of the trenches beneath the pyramids today appear to serve exactly this purpose. They mirror the shape of the pyramid. They mark out internal divisions. They represent the earliest stage of construction, what we might call the ground plan. Once you see these patterns, the plateau begins to feel less like a neutral canvas and more like a foundational diagram, a kind of enormous drafting surface where the builders marked out positions, tested ideas, and shaped the bedrock before lifting a single block. This interpretation doesn't require anything beyond practical planning. Many ancient cultures drew plans directly onto the land itself, carving markers or placing stones to guide construction. But the scale at Giza makes it especially striking. The ground plan is so large that it becomes part of the landscape, and the landscape, in turn, becomes part of the architecture. This integration might explain why certain myths and stories persisted through ancient and medieval history. People sensed that the plateau had been shaped intentionally, not just by the placement of the pyramids, but by the way the ground itself seemed carved, aligned, and organized. When something looks natural, but also bears marks of human intervention, it invites speculation. Some early writers believed the entire plateau was engineered, not in the sense of being artificial, but in the sense of being selected and shaped with such foresight that it felt unnatural to them. The idea that the landscape was designed doesn't imply anything extraordinary. It simply means that geological knowledge guided the planning process. When builders understand geology deeply, their structures interact with the land in ways that seem almost seamless. The pyramids appear anchored to the earth. They appear to rise naturally from it. Their placement looks inevitable rather than imposed. And that sense of inevitability is often a sign of careful planning. There is another intriguing aspect to consider. The plateau contains several flat areas surrounded by natural ridges. These flat areas appear ideal for construction, but they also appear in places where ancient water flow carved away softer stone, leaving behind natural shelves. These shelves provided ready-made platforms. Builders could carve them further, levelling them with precision. The result is a landscape where natural and artificial shaping blend so closely that distinguishing between the two becomes difficult. This blending raises the possibility that the builders intentionally enhanced geological features that already existed. They may have followed natural lines when carving trenches. They may have expanded natural ledges to support structures. They may have deepened natural depressions to create working spaces. And in the process, they transform the plateau into something between a natural formation and an engineered environment. Not a designed landscape in the modern sense, but a selected one, chosen because its natural qualities aligned with the needs of the architecture. When modern researchers examine the plateau using ground-penetrating radar or seismic mapping, they sometimes notice that anomalies beneath the ground follow patterns similar to the structures above. This suggests that the underground environment may reflect construction phases, natural cavities, or geological boundaries that influence the builders' decisions. If the builders knew where the natural cavities were, they might have incorporated that knowledge into their layout. They might have placed internal chambers away from weak zones. They might have reinforced areas where the geology required additional support. The fact that the pyramids have remained stable for thousands of years supports the idea that these decisions were deliberate. The more you explore this geological story, the clearer it becomes that the plateau is not simply the location of the pyramids, it is part of the pyramids. It shapes the structures as much as the structures shape it. The builders didn't impose their will on the landscape. They collaborated with it. They used its strengths. They avoided its weaknesses. And by doing so, they created architecture that feels fused with its environment in a way that few ancient sites achieve. Whenever you look at a structure as massive and enduring as a pyramid, it's almost impossible not to respond emotionally in some way. Even if you approach it with a scientific mindset, focus purely on measurements, geology, or engineering, the sheer presence of the thing makes you step back for a moment. There's something about standing in front of a structure that has outlived entire civilizations, that has remained in place while languages changed, empires rose and fell, and the landscape around it shifted again and again. That sense of scale reaches somewhere in the human mind that calculation alone doesn't explain. And once you notice that reaction, it becomes easier to understand why people have always looked at the pyramids and wondered whether they are part of something larger. This instinct isn't unusual. Humans have always tried to make sense of things that surpass the ordinary. When confronted with something enormous, something unfamiliar, or something unexpectedly precise, the mind tries to give it context. It searches for a framework that makes the experience equal to the feeling it creates. If a structure feels larger than its physical dimensions, people look for meaning that matches that feeling. If a place feels older than recorded history, people imagine stories that stretch back farther than written records. If a building seems too stable to be the work of simple tools, the mind wonders what tools might be missing from the picture. This doesn't come from misunderstanding. It comes from the way humans process awe. Awe is a combination of curiosity, humility, and wonder. It makes people step outside their familiar patterns of thinking. It encourages them to imagine that the world might be bigger or stranger or more layered than they realized. The pyramids evoke this feeling consistently. They do it to travelers who see them for the first time. They do it to researchers who spend decades studying them. They do it to people who have never visited Egypt but see photographs and feel drawn to the structures anyway. The combination of size, age, and precision creates a reaction that is deeply human. This reaction helps explain why stories, theories, and interpretations surrounding the pyramids often extend beyond the physical structures themselves. People want explanations that feel proportional. If the pyramids are enormous, their purpose must be enormous. If their engineering is precise, the intention behind it must be equally precise. If they feel like more than monuments, people imagine they were meant to be more than monuments. This doesn't mean the explanations are right or wrong. It means that when something exceeds our expectations, the mind looks for meaning equal to the impression it leaves. You can see this pattern in many ancient cultures. When people encountered mountains so large they seemed impossible, they imagined they were the homes of gods. When they saw storms they couldn't predict, they created stories about spirits battling in the sky. When they saw monuments built by earlier civilizations, they imagined that giants or divine beings must have shaped them. Human imagination expands to match the scale of what it encounters. The pyramids sit directly in this category. They are enormous. They are stable. They are older than many cultures can easily comprehend, and they produce the same kind of stretching effect on the imagination. In Egypt's case, the stretch was magnified by the culture's own beliefs. Ancient Egyptians had a worldview that connected the physical and the symbolic. Monuments weren't just structures. They were representations. They were bridges between the seen and the unseen. Tombs weren't just burial places. They were gateways. Temples weren't just buildings. They were living spaces for deities. When you combine this symbolic worldview with structures as large as the pyramids, you get layered meanings that blend architecture, religion, and narrative. Later generations inherited these layered meanings, sometimes without understanding the original context. As the meanings shifted, the sense of depth surrounding the pyramids grew. Over time, this layering created an environment where myths and physical structures merged. People saw the pyramids as more than stone because the stories they heard described them as more than stone. They imagined underground worlds not because they saw them, but because their minds filled gaps left by history. They imagined hidden chambers because the architecture seemed to encourage the idea of hidden places. They imagined larger purposes because the scale of the structures made small purposes feel inadequate. These reactions weren't unreasonable. They were human responses to a place that inspires the desire for something beyond what can be measured. You can see this pattern today. People walk around the pyramids and feel compelled to ask questions that stretch beyond engineering. They ask why the pyramids were built. They ask what meanings were attached to different architectural choices. They ask whether the structures served functions we haven't identified. They ask whether the builders understood something about the land, the sky, or the passage of time that we have overlooked. These questions arise not because the structures lack explanations, but because the explanations feel small compared to the impression the pyramids create. Another part of this human response comes from the desire for continuity. People want to feel connected to something larger than themselves. When they encounter structures that have survived thousands of years, they feel a kind of anchoring connection to the past. The pyramids offer a physical link to people who lived in a world completely different from ours, yet experienced the same sun, the same sky, the same horizon. This continuity feels reassuring. It gives people the sense that time has a shape, that certain things endure even as everything else changes. The pyramids become not just structures but symbols of stability in a world that constantly shifts. This emotional connection influences the way people interpret the underground landscape of the plateau. When they hear about natural cavities, sealed chambers, unexplored spaces, or geological layers that haven't been fully mapped, their minds fill in the gaps with ideas that match the feeling the pyramids evoke. If the structures above ground feel monumental, then the spaces below ground seem like they must be part of something monumental as well. This imagination isn't a distraction. It's a reflection of the way the human mind tries to create narratives that fit the experience. Even researchers feel this pull. Scientists may approach the pyramids with analytical tools, but they still experience the same physical presence, the same sense of scale, the same atmosphere of antiquity. When a new anomaly shows up on a scan, they know it could be a natural cavity or a carved space. But the part of the mind that responds to wonder still pays attention. Scientists are not immune to the sense that the pyramids invite deeper questions. This is one reason why the site continues to draw research, decades after many of its basic features were already identified. The questions never quite feel complete. The human need for something larger than stone also shapes the cultural memory of the pyramids. Every generation adds its own interpretation. For some, the pyramids represent religious devotion. For others, they represent scientific achievement. For many, they represent a mystery, something that seems solid on the surface, but contains enough unanswered details to keep people engaged. These layers of meaning accumulate. They become part of the site's identity. And once meaning becomes part of a place, it's difficult to separate the physical structure from the ideas surrounding it. Part of this comes from the fact that the pyramids are incomplete in a historical sense. We know when they were built and by whom, but we don't have the builders' voices. We don't have their diaries, their notes, their conversations, their thoughts about what they were doing. We don't have the symbolic explanations they might have attached to different architectural choices. We don't have the practical instructions they passed across generations. Without these voices, the structures stand on their own, and the gaps in the record invite interpretation. When the human mind encounters gaps, it fills them, sometimes with practical assumptions, sometimes with imagination, sometimes with stories that blend the two. This blending isn't a flaw, it is part of how humans make sense of the world. The pyramids encourage this process because they occupy a space between the familiar and the unfamiliar. The stone is familiar, the scale is not. The engineering techniques are understandable. The precision feels extraordinary. The landscape is natural. The way the structures sit within it feels intentional. When a place combines familiar elements in unfamiliar ways, it sparks creativity. It invites both logical and imaginative thinking. The underground parts of the plateau become environments where both kinds of thinking converge. You can also see the human need for larger meaning in the way stories evolve when new discoveries are made. When researchers find a new void in the pyramid, people don't imagine it as a small cavity. They imagine it as something meaningful, a missing chamber, a hidden archive, a structural element with symbolic importance. The mind jumps to conclusions not out of misunderstanding, but out of the desire to connect new information to the emotional impact of the whole site. If the pyramids inspire wonder, then new discoveries feel like part of a larger narrative. This connection between physical structures and emotional response helps explain why the pyramids remain culturally significant, even in a modern world where technology answers many questions. They represent something older than our systems of knowledge, something built with patience rather than speed, something that values endurance rather than innovation. People living in a rapidly changing world often feel drawn to places that seem immune to change. The pyramids offer that sense of permanence. They give the mind a place to rest, a reference point that feels stable, and yet, part of their power comes from the fact that they still contain unanswered questions. The stability invites curiosity rather than ending it. The underground features, the geological layers, the unexplained cavities, they create a sense that the site has more to say. Not necessarily dramatically more, but more in a quiet, enduring way. Enough to keep people returning to the subject. Enough to keep researchers studying it. Enough to keep the imagination active without losing its grounding in the physical world. This relationship between people and monuments becomes especially clear when you think about the way the pyramids appear at different times of day. In bright sunlight, they look sharp, clear, and geometric. In the softer light of morning or evening, they look heavier and older. At night, when the desert grows quiet, they appear almost motionless against the sky. People respond differently at each moment. A scientist might think about the angles during the day and the internal chambers at night. A traveller might think about history during the day and eternity at night. The structures remain the same, but the mind interacts with them differently depending on the light. This flexibility in interpretation is part of the pyramid's enduring power. They hold meaning without dictating meaning. They allow people to bring their own thoughts to the site while still giving them something concrete to stand on. The underground environment mirrors this dynamic. Some features are known, some are partially known, some are only suspected. The combination creates a landscape that feels both grounded and open to interpretation. It invites questions without demanding answers. When you step back and think about all of this, the emotional impact, the cultural memory, the gaps in the historical record, the geological context, it becomes clear that the pyramids are not purely physical structures. They are psychological landscapes. They invite the mind to move beyond simple explanations, not because the explanations are lacking, but because the structures themselves create a certain kind of experience, a sense that the world is larger than it appears, a sense that the past holds more layers than we can easily uncover, a sense that even structures made of stone can interact with human perception in ways that feel almost narrative. When you reach this point in the journey, after spending so much time with the stones, the underground spaces, the stories, and the quiet science wrapped around the pyramids, something subtle begins to happen. The subject no longer feels like a puzzle that needs solving. It starts to feel more like a landscape you're simply moving through, a place that doesn't demand conclusions, a place that doesn't reward rushing toward answers, a place where the unknown is not a problem to fix but a space to rest your attention for a little while. This shift becomes clearer the longer you sit with the idea that the pyramids are more than what we can see and less than what the most imaginative stories describe. They occupy a middle ground that encourages steady reflection rather than certainty. If you imagine yourself standing near the edge of the plateau as the sun lowers and the air cools, the desert grows noticeably quieter. The wind settles. The sand stops shifting as quickly. The horizon darkens by degrees rather than by moments. The pyramids become silhouettes long before the sky becomes fully dark. In that light, they don't look like puzzles. They look like markers of time. They look like reminders that the ground beneath your feet has held secrets for longer than any single culture has existed. When you stand there with no hurry and let the quiet collect around you, the idea of hidden worlds beneath the sand doesn't feel sensational. It feels natural, not because the ground is guaranteed to contain immense tunnels or vast structures, but because so much of the landscape remains unmapped, unseen, and shaped by forces that move slower than human history. The desert has a way of softening ideas that feel sharp in daylight. Questions that seemed urgent become gentle. Speculations that felt dramatic become calm. The thought that the pyramids might rest on top of something larger becomes less about dramatic discovery and more about the way time creates depth in the land. When wind moves sand over centuries, it buries things no one remembers. When natural cavities slowly widen beneath limestone layers, they form shapes that no one intended. When ancient builders carve into rock, time later fills those spaces with sediment, making the intentional feel accidental or the accidental feel intentional. These processes create hidden features in the ground, whether we search for them or not. People sometimes speak as though the underground landscape at Giza is a single coherent environment with one purpose. But the reality is much simpler. The underground world is a collection of natural spaces, carved spaces, unfinished spaces, filled spaces, and geological features shaped long before the pyramids existed. When you think about the desert in this way, it becomes easier to imagine how stories of hidden chambers formed. They didn't grow from unrealistic expectations, they grew from the way the land itself behaves. The plateau hides things because that's what plateaus do. The sand covers things because that's what sand does. And the deeper layers of limestone carry their own quiet, ancient patterns that people have tried to understand for thousands of years. Standing there in the fading light, the idea that something still sleeps beneath the sands doesn't feel like a guess. It feels like an observation, not of specific structures or specific tunnels, but of the way the desert conceals and reveals slowly, almost reluctantly. You might not know what is buried beneath your feet, but you can feel certain that something is there because deserts always contain layers that haven't been touched. Geological layers, remnants of earlier construction phases, unfinished quarries, natural hollows, and the ordinary debris of ancient life. Together, these things form a hidden world that isn't dramatic but is undeniably real. It may not match the scale of the pyramids above, but it still adds depth to the idea that the visible monuments are only part of a much larger story. If you take a moment to imagine what the plateau looked like thousands of years ago, before the sand rose and fell across its surface, the picture becomes even clearer. Workers moved through open quarries. Trenches revealed layers of bedrock that are now buried. Tools left marks on surfaces that wind eventually erased. Caves that might have been shallow became deeper through erosion. Channels carved by ancient water now sit sealed below layers of sediment. Every stage of activity left traces. Some remain visible, others lie buried. Over time, those buried traces become the quiet foundation of a site that feels deeper than the visible architecture can explain. There is something restful in recognizing this. The unknown beneath the pyramids is not a single dramatic mystery. It's a collection of small layered mysteries created by time, erosion, construction, abandonment, and geology. When people talk about hidden worlds, they sometimes imagine enormous underground complexes, but the reality is that hidden worlds can be subtle. A small chamber sealed for thousands of years is a hidden world. A natural cavity untouched since the plateau formed is a hidden world. A passage that was carved and then abandoned when plans changed is a hidden world. A layer of bedrock that reveals a different ancient environment is a hidden world. The desert holds many such spaces. None of them require exaggeration to feel significant. When you frame it this way, the idea that the pyramids may be only the surface of something larger becomes less about scale and more about perspective. You're not imagining gigantic structures stretching under the plateau. You're simply acknowledging that the visible part of the site is only one layer of a deeper environment. The pyramids rise above ground, but they also anchor into the ground. They sit on top of geological layers filled with natural patterns. They sit near quarries carved by workers across generations. They sit above carved trenches that define their earliest plans. They sit above areas where sediment has filled spaces once open to the air. All of this creates a layered environment beneath the surface, a quiet one, shaped by time rather than intention. Thinking about it in this way shifts your attention from dramatic speculation to steady wonder. The kind of wonder that doesn't need urgency. The kind that doesn't need discovery. The kind that allows you to be comfortable with not knowing everything. This is the kind of wonder that often appears late in the day, when the desert has cooled and the light is soft. It's the kind of wonder that encourages you to slow down, breathe more evenly, and simply let your attention settle without searching for conclusions. The pyramids reinforce this feeling because they stand so calmly. They don't lean, they don't sag, they don't crumble in ways that would interrupt the sense of stability. They show that human effort, layered with natural forces, can create structures that outlast their makers by such a wide margin that the original intentions begin to blur. The people who built these monuments planned carefully. They prepared the ground. They carved with precision. They shaped stone into forms that still make sense thousands of years later. But even they couldn't control how the desert would transform their work. They couldn't predict which chambers would fill with sand or which cuts in the bedrock would remain visible. The underground environment became shaped partly by their hands and partly by the slow, steady movement of the desert. This combination creates the feeling that the pyramids have roots extending into the past deeper than the structures themselves. If you imagine yourself sitting in the sand not far from the base of one of the pyramids, the scale becomes even more noticeable. The blocks form lines that recede upward until they feel nearly vertical from your perspective. The base stretches horizontally beyond your peripheral vision. The stone under your hand might still show the grain of ancient carving. The air might carry the faint scent of dry minerals warming in the sun. In that moment, the concept of something beneath the sands doesn't feel like a secret waiting to be uncovered. It feels like a steady truth about any landscape this old. There is always more beneath than what sits on the surface. This idea can be grounding. Instead of focusing on what is hidden, you start thinking about the stability created by what is buried. The layers beneath the pyramid support the structures. The bedrock provides a foundation. The geological patterns guide the distribution of weight. The unseen world is not just a place of potential discovery, it is a place of support, a place that allows the surface to exist as it does. Thinking about the underground space in this way turns speculation into a form of calm appreciation, not for dramatic mysteries, but for the quiet depth of the land itself. The human mind often looks for meanings that match the scale of what it sees. With the pyramids, that instinct leads to stories of hidden complexity. But as you rest with the idea longer, the need for grand explanations fades. The site doesn't need to contain anything large beneath the surface to feel expansive. The size of the pyramids alone creates enough mental space to allow the imagination to drift. The underground environment simply adds depth to that space, not in the sense of hidden cities or vast rooms, but in the sense of an ancient land shaped by forces that moved long before people arrived and continued long after. This perspective lets you settle into the subject without tension. You don't need to choose between skepticism and belief. You don't need to decide which legends are accurate. You don't need to determine whether the pyramids hide vast secrets. You can simply sit with the understanding that the site is layered, that time shapes landscapes in slow and intricate ways, and that the feeling of depth surrounding the pyramids is justified even if no dramatic revelations wait beneath the ground. The wonder comes not from expecting grand discoveries, but from appreciating the quiet possibility that the ground still holds elements of its long history. When night finally settles over the plateau, a different kind of stillness takes over. The air cools enough that the stone surfaces stop radiating heat. The desert becomes quieter than most people ever experience. The darkness removes the sense of scale, leaving only outlines against the faint light of the sky. In that moment, the pyramids become shapes rather than structures. They feel like part of the desert rather than objects on it, and the ground beneath them feels deeper simply because you can't see it. This is the moment when drifting into wonder becomes easiest. Not the kind of wonder that demands answers, the kind that lets questions rest, the kind that lets you breathe more slowly, the kind that helps you see the pyramids not as puzzles, but as companions to the landscape. The kind that lets you accept that the sands will always hide some things, reveal others, and shift the boundary between the known and the unknown without any urgency. If you take a slow breath here and imagine the plateau beneath the surface, you can picture the layers of limestone shaped by ancient seas. You can picture the shallow cavities left by water that flowed long before humans. You can picture the cuts made by tools and the places where sand has settled. You can picture the quiet darkness beneath the stone. None of it needs to be dramatic. It simply exists. It holds the history of geology, the traces of human work and the natural processes that continue quietly even now. This final sense of calm doesn't close the subject. It doesn't finish anything. It simply offers a soft landing after a long journey through stone, engineering, geology, myth, and memory. Just as the desert shifts slowly from day into night, the exploration shifts from curiosity into rest. You can carry the thought that the pyramids stand above something larger not as a claim, but as a gentle awareness that any ancient landscape contains more layers than the eye can see. And the knowledge that some of those layers will remain hidden isn't frustrating. It's peaceful. The sands will keep their secrets at their own pace. The stones will hold their silence. And you can leave the subject here, letting the last traces of wonder settle quietly, exactly where they belong in the calm space between what is known and what still sleeps beneath the desert's surface.